Asian Godfathers. Money and Power in Hong Kong and Southeast Asia. Joe Studwell. By the second half of the 19th century, the pieces were in place for a globalization-driven boom which in certain respects prefigured the one that began in the 1990s. The demand impetus was the developed world's hunger for agricultural and mineral commodities which were either buried in the ground in Southeast Asia or could be grown there. Vast tracts of land were available for the establishment of plantations. Technological facilitation came with the opening of the Suez Canal in 1869 and the concurrent development of steamships that allowed for low-cost bulk shipping throughout the year. The final component was abundant, cheap, imported Chinese and Indian labor. As a general distinction, it is fair to say that the great majority of Indians were imported to work in estate agriculture in the British colonies and parts of Indonesia, with minority subsets of manual labor for public works projects and colonial civil servants. A tiny elite of Indian entrepreneurs, including Parsas, Sindhis and Chettiar, was spread around the region. Chinese immigrants dominated mining, but were also widely dispersed across trading, retailing, what would today be called logistic services, agriculture and more. This reflected the fact that the average Chinese had relatively greater freedom of choice in making migration decisions. The vast majority of Indian emigrants between 1850 and the First World War were indentured agricultural laborers, meaning that they signed contracts to work on plantations, were transported to those plantations and housed in barracks and, if they survived, were usually sent back to India. The southern Chinese used credit ticket systems, which meant that migrants were bound to employers until they had paid off their passage, with interest, but subsequently they were relatively more likely to stay on in Southeast Asia and merge into the established, mainly urban communities of overseas Chinese that had roots going back centuries. A United Nations report on migration published in 2004 makes a brave attempt to pull together historical records from India and concludes that 30 million Indians left for destinations around the world between 1834 and 1937, but 24 million came back. We do not know the returnee proportion among Chinese because China has no state records comparable to those maintained by the British in India, but it was certainly much lower. This is an important point. There were huge numbers of Indians around in colonial Southeast Asia, but they did not become more important to local economies in the long run because most of them did not hang around long enough to become embedded in society. They were also, relative to the Chinese, a more downtrodden and unhappy group of people. The Indian Arcacia, or recruiters, who organized indentured labor for export focused much of their attention on minority groups at the bottom of the caste ladder, which has no sociological equivalent in China, like Tamils from the south or hill tribesmen from the northeast. These people suited plantation owners and colonial governments because, unlike the more uppity Chinese, they created no trouble. Sir Frederick Weld, governor of the Straits Settlements from 1880 to 1887, recommended an increase in the importation of Indians when leaving the job with the words, "Indians are a peaceable and easily governed race." He probably did not realize he was used to a rather atypical cross-section of Indians. The original agricultural produce that had drawn Europeans to Southeast Asia was spices, used largely for curing meat in the era before artificial refrigeration. But the 19th century brought a host of other cash crops, among which sugar from the Philippines and Thailand was the most important. Then came tin, first mined by Chinese gangs in Indonesia but later found in far greater quantities in Malaysia and southern Thailand. At the turn of the century there was rubber, in whose production Indian labor was thoroughly dominant, which was an essential input in the dawning age of the automobile and for many other consumer products. There was also a rolling cycle of commodity booms in the region in which technological advances further increased the scale of trade. In mining, for example, new technologies transformed the activity from an essentially manual undertaking with mattocks to a large-scale mechanical one involving dredges. Change, change, change. From the perspective of the established Southeast Asian godfather, the end of the 19th century was an era of both greater uncertainty and greater opportunity. Traditional assimilated Chinese Thai, Indonesian Peranakan, Malaysian Baba and Philippines mestizo elites were challenged by the arrival of wave after wave of hungry immigrants, who were not always easy to control. At the same time, as the Thai state and the different colonial regimes became stronger, they had less need of freelance revenue farmers and monopoly holders and gradually dismantled these arrangements, beginning in the 1880s. Nonetheless, the economic pie was becoming much bigger. And the tripartite split between colonial power, indigenous political elite and economic elite of now overwhelmingly Chinese origin continued to reward the tycoon who could most effectively work his external relationships while maintaining authority within a burgeoning immigrant community. Indian labor was usually imported direct by colonial plantation owners and hence threw up fewer Indian godfathers. A look at the salient characteristics of standout tycoons at the turn of the century highlights this. Oei Tayangham was the richest man in Indonesia. Based in Semarang in central Java, home to the island's dominant Peranakan opium farmers in 19th century, Oei was the son of an established merchant who had been appointed Majuer of the Semarang Chinese. The son, however, was able to multiply his father's already considerable wealth through cosmopolitan expansion from a traditional base. In the 1880s, when revenue farmers were hit by an economic downturn, he tendered for and won important tax farm concessions. He spoke no Dutch, but understood the language of colonial formality better than most Europeans. One of his daughters recalled in her autobiography, "I used to stand on the wide veranda of our palace, waiting for the sight of Papa's carriage racing through the valley below. By the time it swept through our entrance gates, a Malay servant had appeared from nowhere carrying a hot towel soaked in eau de cologne on a silver tray. Papa, impressively handsome in immaculate white trousers and a smart, Western-style white jacket, would wipe his hands and face with the scented towel before he stepped down from the carriage and approached me. It was like a ballet." Oei was a lavish entertainer and gift-giver to colonial officers. Like his father, he was Majuer of the local Chinese, but he lived on a large estate in the European quarter of town. He spoke Javanese and Malay better than any Chinese dialect. In business, Oei followed a diversification strategy that became the hallmark of Southeast Asian tycoons of the era. He obtained a steady source of cash flow from revenue farms, in particular opium, and used it to finance expansion into myriad other activities. He was most prominent in the sugar industry, developing plantations and constructing processing mills. The latter used imported European machinery maintained by Dutch technicians. Oei also employed Dutch accountants and administrators in the key roles. He expanded into shipping and opened a bank in Semarang. At the time of the First World War, Oei relocated to Singapore, where he died in 1924. His was the one local business that could compete for scale with large Dutch companies. Still more adaptable was Lokyu, reckoned the richest Chinese on the Malaysian peninsula at the turn of the century. He built an early business provisioning rival Chinese mining gangs, and the triads that represented them, with food and weapons on the west coast. As the British took formal control of Malaya from 1874, he developed an open-cast tin mining empire employing thousands of Chinese laborers whom he also supplied with opium, liquor and gambling facilities under state revenue farm licenses. Lokyu worked closely with Chinese secret societies to import and manage his laborers. He was a member of the powerful Gihin Triad. British residents in the key mining states relied on him both to control the Chinese populations and to contribute a large share of fiscal revenues. In turn, Lokyu was at pains to put his colonial counterparties at ease. He acquired English manners, developed a friendship with the first resident general of the four federated Malay states, Frank Swettenham, and was one of the main sponsors of the elite English language school in Kuala Lumpur, the Victoria Institution. He entered ventures with English and Scottish companies, as well as with the Tamil Indian tycoon Thambusami Pillai. His negotiating power with the colonial rulers was considerable. When, for instance, the tin price fell in 1896, the Selangor state administration took the unprecedented step of giving him a reduction on the fixed fee he paid for the opium farm because he was deemed so important to state business. In 1898 he was offered a range of revenue farms in the Benteng area of Pahang State at nominal cost, and reduced taxes on the tin he mined, as an incentive to open up the area. Apart from mining, Lok Yu diversified into real estate, rubber plantations and more. He was given a British knighthood. The strategy of integrating revenue farming operations with mining and plantation ventures was common to tycoons around the region. Most obviously, it reduced the cost of already cheap labor. Thio Sayat, whose interests were truly regional, ran opium, liquor and tobacco farms on both sides of the Malacca Straits, in Sumatra, Malaya and Singapore, and conjoined these with a vast empire centered on plantations. The Kaw family developed an integrated tin mining and revenue farm business that stretched from Penang to southwest Thailand, and thereafter diversified. In Singapore it was the families that dominated pepper and gambir, used in tanning and dyeing, cultivation, the biggest employers there in the late 19th century, which held revenue farms, including the Key Opium Farm, and contributed as much as half the government's annual revenues. Wherever there were revenue farms, which inferred a delegation of state powers of coercion, there were also triad enforcers. But this was not a great concern to colonial governments that had long since recognized that accepting the presence of the secret societies was the easiest way to manage Chinese immigration. As the Straits Observer noted on February 17, 1899, government has no direct means of communication with the lower-class Chinese, and it is this work which the secret societies carry on. In the Philippines, the greatest of the cabecillas, literally, headman, was Don Carlos Palenque Chinchianshan. He was a coolie broker, operator of a major opium monopoly and tax collector with general commercial interests ranging from textiles to sugar and rice trading to real estate. Arriving from China's Fujian province as a chain migrant with relatives already settled in Manila, he learned Spanish, converted to Catholicism and found a powerful colonial mentor in Colonel Carlos Palenque y Gutierrez, whose name he adopted. At the same time, he was careful to establish his credentials with Imperial Qing China, thereby shoring up his role as leader of the burgeoning Chinese community in the Philippines. Like many contemporaries, he purchased Mandarin titles and donned Mandarin robes for formal occasions. Chinchianshan was instrumental in pressing the Qing government to open a consulate in Manila, which was located in buildings that also housed the Gobernadorcillo de los Sanglais. As the Chinese leader was formally titled by the Spanish, Chen sometimes held this post and sometimes merely influenced it, and the Tribunal de los Sanglais, a court that Chen was repeatedly accused of manipulating. He and his son were consuls. Chen died a very rich man in 1901. He had established perfect sociological equilibrium between the immigrant Chinese and colonial Spanish communities, receiving honors from both states. As one historian of the Philippines, Andrew Wilson, observes, the Chinese experience of the late 19th century made it clear that social and economic power rested with those who not only controlled the institutions that defined Chinese identity in the colonial Philippines, but also had the greatest rapport with and institutional linkages to external sources of authority. Not everyone was admiring of the ability to fulfill these criteria. The novelist and Philippine nationalist José Rizal, himself of mixed-race Chinese origin, almost certainly used Chinchianshan as the model for the obsequious, duplicitous character Quiroga the Chinaman in his novel El Filibusterismo, 1891. It was the hybrid nature of Quiroga's identity that Rizal found so objectionable, expressed, said the author, in the lamentable confusion of styles in his house. Yet the ornamental Chinese gardens, Greek columns, Scottish ironwork and Italian marble floors favored by Southeast Asian godfathers also reflected their strengths. Their work drove them to try to be all things to all men. In the process the curiosities they spawned were not merely architectural. Men such as Oei Taiyong Ham, or key collaborators of the British colonial government in Hong Kong like Sir Kai Ho Kai, set up by themselves and by colonizers as leaders of their communities, had only the shakiest grasp of any Chinese dialect. They were truly stuck in a cultural limbo, shaped by circumstance. Brief sketches of these turn-of-the-century godfathers show the extent to which their activities were shaped by the environment in which they operated. They sought revenue farms because these were the easiest way to make a lot of money. The fattest margins were achieved in the middle of the 19th century by Chinese revenue farmers who knew much more about the value of their monopolies than the states that granted them. As states became stronger and better informed, rigged bids, late payment and the like became more difficult. Revenue farming was naturally combined with employment of immigrant Chinese labor, which was flooding into Southeast Asia from the mid-19th century and was a major consumer of the offerings of the vice farms. And management of labor was tied up with community leadership of the mutually hostile immigrant speech groups that were looking for work. Often backed by speech group-specific triads, the tycoon could create a wondrous, circular business in which almost all money ended up in his hands, operate vice and other farms, employ dependent immigrants in labor-intensive businesses like mining and plantations, often in remote regions, and then sell vice products and services, and anything else required, to the workers in order to recover most of their income. On top of all this, the Godfather provided the only form of political identity that emigrants had in their new homeland. He was the person who represented community interests before the holders of ultimate political authority. But colonial power, and international economics in the first great era of globalization, shaped the world of the aspirant Godfather in more ways than simply by making him a revenue farmer and exploiter of his co-nationals. The period established an economic architecture in Southeast Asia that would prove hard to change. The colonial powers had no dastardly master plan for the region, but they did institute the trading structure that was most favorable to them. This meant the import into the first world of commodities in return for the export to Southeast Asia of finished manufactures to pay, at least in part, for those commodities. In the process, the commodity boom was accompanied by a regional rationalization of output. Shaped by circumstance. Brief sketches of these turn-of-the-century godfathers show the extent to which their activities were shaped by the environment in which they operated. They sought revenue farms because these were the easiest way to make a lot of money. The fattest margins were achieved in the middle of the 19th century by Chinese revenue farmers who knew much more about the value of their monopolies than the states that granted them. As states became stronger and better informed, rigged bids, late payment and the like became more difficult. Revenue farming was naturally combined with employment of immigrant Chinese labor, which was flooding into Southeast Asia from the mid-19th century and was a major consumer of the offerings of the vice farms. And management of labor was tied up with community leadership of the mutually hostile immigrant speech groups that were looking for work. Often backed by speech group-specific triads, the tycoon could create a wondrous, circular business in which almost all money ended up in his hands, operate vice and other farms, employ dependent immigrants in labor-intensive businesses like mining and plantations, often in remote regions, and then sell vice products and services, and anything else required, to the workers in order to recover most of their income. On top of all this, the Godfather provided the only form of political identity that emigrants had in their new homeland. He was the person who represented community interests before the holders of ultimate political authority. But colonial power, and international economics in the first great era of globalization, shaped the world of the aspirant Godfather in more ways than simply by making him a revenue farmer and exploiter of his co-nationals. The period established an economic architecture in Southeast Asia that would prove hard to change. The colonial powers had no dastardly master plan for the region, but they did institute the trading structure that was most favorable to them. This meant the import into the first world of commodities in return for the export to Southeast Asia of finished manufactures to pay, at least in part, for those commodities. In the process, the commodity boom was accompanied by a regional rationalization of output.